Hello and welcome to our short recording on the central pathways that convey tactile and proprioceptive sensation. So what we're referring to here in our schematic is the receptors, and those receptors could be our proprioceptors or our touch receptors, our tactile receptors. They bring that information into the spinal cord, and then we're talking about the pathway within the spinal cord all the way up through our brainstem, medulla pons midbrain, to our thalamus, and then up to our, in particular, primary somatosensory cortex. That pathway will give us conscious perception of those proprioceptive and tactile experiences of our body. That will be covered in this slide. The next slide will then talk about the unconscious pathway, and that's the pathway that comes from the receptor into the spinal cord, up the spinal cord, and then into the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. That pathway is unconscious proprioception in particular. So to start with, what we're going to talk about are our mechanoreceptors or our tactile receptors. We can talk about the lower half of the body and the upper half of the body, but basically we call this whole pathway the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. And it goes all the way from our periphery. It could go from our big toe, for example, our right big toe, all the way up to our primary somatosensory cortex. So it's a very long pathway. In these sensory pathways, there are three neurons. The original neuron, which is the mechanosensor, out in the periphery, will come into the spinal cord and travel up the spinal cord to the caudal medulla. There it will synapse onto the second order neuron. Second order neuron decussates or crosses the midline. That's what decussation means. Travels all the way up through the rest of the midbrain and then synapses at the thalamus, in particular the VPL nucleus of the thalamus. And then the third order neuron travels from the thalamus up to the somatosensory cortex. So three neurons in this pathway, and this pathway crosses the midline. So what's happening here is that our proprioceptors, things like muscle stretch receptors, our Golgi tendon organs, our joint receptors, those larger diameter axon, really fast or rapid action potential propagation is flying into the central nervous system and jumping into what we call the dorsal column part of the spinal cord. At the level of the lumbar spinal cord, we call it the dorsal column, but the gracilis fasciculus. And so that those fibers will travel all the way up until we get to what we call the gracile nucleus. And so that's the pathway of the first order neuron stopping for the lower body, the lower half of the body. Again, synapsing onto the second order neuron. Second order then immediately decussates, and now we call this ascending pathway the medial lemniscus pathway. So that's the second half of the name, the dorsal column, which is through the spinal cord, medial lemniscus, which is through the brainstem pathway. So that medial lemniscus pathway comes all the way up to our VPL nucleus of the thalamus, synapses onto our third order neuron. Third order neuron is going to go out into our primary somatosensory cortex. Same thing occurs if we're talking about mechanoreceptors or touch receptors for the upper half of the body, up to the neck, that is. Those come in, they jump in the dorsal column, but it's this more lateral portion of the dorsal column, and we call that the cuneate tract or cuneate fasciculus. Comes all the way up, synapsing onto the second order in the cuneate nucleus. Those fibers then join in with our medial lemniscus, travel all the way up to the VPL nucleus of the thalamus, and then out to our primary somatosensory cortex. So those two pathways essentially are the same. They're just split in terms of lower half of the body and upper half of the body. Now, when we're looking at our cross-section of the spinal cord, this is what we're referring to, that fasciculus gracilis or fasciculus cuneatus, or cuneate tract, we can also call them. So that's in the spinal cord, they're where those pathways are traveling. And so that's what I'm referring to down here. Now, when we get up towards the top, just draw our attention to this VP complex. The VPL nucleus is this portion here. And so you can imagine that these second order neurons, which are the medial lemniscus neurons, are coming up, synapsing in that nucleus, that particular nuclei bundle of the thalamus. Synapse onto the third order. Third order then come out to this primary somatosensory cortex. And remembering when we talk about the primary somatosensory cortex, it's the somatosensory homunculus, which has that particular map. So if that signal is coming from the big toe, it's coming all the way up, synapsing at the gracile nucleus, decussating, traveling up the medial lemniscus, synapsing again at the VPL, and then it sends that information out to the big toe area of that map. If it's for the fingers, for instance, then it's coming in, it's joining in the cuneate tract or the fasciculus cuneatus, and comes up, synapses onto the second order at the cuneate nucleus, travels all the way up through the brainstem in the medial lemniscus to the VPL. The third order then comes out to the hand area of the map. So very specialized mapping of these pathways. And so that's our conscious perception of proprioception and touch sensation. And conscious because it is getting up here to our cortex, our cerebral cortex. And that's where we have conscious perception occurring. Now, there's another pathway that's very important as well, and it's called the spinocerebellar pathway. And so what we're talking about are these muscle spindle afferents for the lower body in particular. There's not only one branch that goes up the previously mentioned dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, but we also need to provide a copy of that information to the cerebellum, because remembering the cerebellum is our coordinator and it needs to coordinate the current ideas of how we want to perform actions that are being sent down from the motor cortex with current proprioceptive happenings so that we can update movement plans. So what's happening here is that we have these muscle spindles that are coming in. We're then sending those collaterals, we call them, up the dorsal column until we get to Clark's nucleus, which is usually in the lumbar regions of our spinal cord, in that intermediate zone, and we call it Clark's nucleus. Synapse onto the second order, we then jump in the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, which we can see here in this portion of the spinal cord cross-section, and it travels all the way up our dorsal spinocerebellar tract and then comes into the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. It now provides the cerebellum with current, up-to-date proprioceptive events of the lower half of the body. The upper half can do the same thing, it's just that if you imagine those upper half coming in here, jumping into the cuneate tract, and then once we get to the caudal medulla, we synapse onto a second order neuron in the external cuneate nucleus, which then goes up into the cerebellum. So still only unconscious, because both of those are coming into the cerebellum. The cerebellum isn't part of our conscious experience. So basically, this pathway is unconscious coordination, helps with coordination control, because what we're doing is we actually have our output from, if you imagine, we're currently moving, and those current movement experiences were due to our inverse model creating this desired state, or helping to create this desired state of what kind of kinematics and kinetics were required to produce a output. We have proprioceptive experiences or sensory feedback coming in that can be compared to that internal model. And so what our cerebellum is kind of doing is helping with that comparison in real time so that we can work out that error signal and improve the inverse model next time we produce that skill. And remembering that that information is coming into what we call the spinocerebellum areas, these midline structures of the vermis and so on of the cerebellum. So we're coming up the spinal cord in that dorsal spinocerebellar tract, in via the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and we come into this portion of the cerebellum, the spinocerebellum. Remembering that the cerebrocerebellum is receiving those motor commands from the motor cortex, so we can now mix those two bits of information, mix what the plan of action is with what is actually happening in real time with our body. That's all then sent back up to the sensory motor cortex to inform them of a better model for next movement pattern to be modeled and sent out or commanded. So that there was our two pathways, our conscious and unconscious, respectively, pathways in regards to the conveying of tactile and proprioceptive information in our central nervous system. Thanks for listening, and talk to you soon.